Story disclaimer. This story is a work of fiction and is intended for entertainment purposes only. The content includes dark themes, horror elements, and fictional depictions of rituals and sacrifices that are purely imaginative and not reflective of any real-life practices or beliefs. Viewer discretion is advised. This video is not suitable for younger audiences, and parental guidance is recommended. The story does not endorse or promote any harmful behavior, violence, or dangerous activities. Please note that all characters, events, and settings are entirely fictional and created for the purpose of storytelling. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events, is purely coincidental. In the village of Ezi-Ora, where the shadows seem to breathe with a life of their own, darkness is more than just the absence of light. It is a curse, ancient and insidious, that has plagued the villagers for generations. Ada, a young woman of unyielding courage, must confront the malevolent force that lurks within the heart of the forest, a darkness that has taken root not just in the land but in her very bloodline. As she delves deeper into the secrets of her heritage, she uncovers a terrifying truth: the curse is bound to her, and breaking it may require the ultimate sacrifice. With the fate of her people hanging in the balance, Ada embarks on a harrowing journey through realms of shadow and light, where the line between hero and monster blurs, and every choice could mean the difference between salvation and eternal doom. In a world where the spirits test the living, and the darkness whispers promises of power, Ada must decide how much she is willing to lose to save everything she loves. Will she banish the darkness, or will it consume her and the village she fights to protect? The battle for Ezi-Ora is about to begin, and the cost of victory may be more than Ada can bear. In a small village called Ezi-Ora, nestled between the thick forests and the wide river, life was simple. Children played in the dusty streets, and the elders gathered under the big baobab tree to share stories. But one evening, something strange happened. A stranger arrived in the village. The stranger was tall, with skin as dark as the night and eyes that seemed to glow with an eerie light. He wore a long, tattered robe that whispered like the wind as he walked. No one knew where he came from, and when he spoke, his voice was like a cold breeze that sent shivers down the spine. "Who are you?" asked Nkem, the village chief, his voice trembling slightly. "I am a traveler," the stranger replied. "I have come to warn you." "Warn us? About what?" Nkem asked, trying to stay brave. The stranger smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the kind of smile that made your heart race with fear. "There is something evil in your village," he said. "Something dark that hides in the shadows. It seeks to destroy you all." The villagers murmured in fear. They had always lived peacefully, and nothing evil had ever troubled them. But the stranger's words filled them with dread. "Leave our village," shouted Chika, a young warrior, stepping forward with his spear. "We don't need your lies." The stranger's eyes glowed even brighter. "You cannot fight what you cannot see," he said. "But beware, the darkness is closer than you think." Before anyone could react, the stranger turned and walked into the night, disappearing into the forest. The villagers were left standing in silence, their hearts heavy with fear. No one slept that night, and as the moon hid behind dark clouds, the first signs of the evil began to stir in Ezi-Ora. The following morning, the village was shrouded in an eerie silence. The birds didn't sing, and the usually lively animals were nowhere to be seen. The villagers gathered in the square, their faces pale with worry. "Did anyone see the stranger leave?" asked Nkem. "No," said a woman, her voice trembling. "It's as if he vanished into thin air." As the sun began to rise, the chilling wind blew through the village, carrying with it a sound, a whisper. It was faint at first, but as the day went on, it grew louder. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere, yet nowhere at the same time. Children clung to their mothers, and the elders muttered prayers under their breath. Chika, the young warrior who had challenged the stranger, felt a cold dread settle in his heart. He had always been fearless, but now something in those whispers made him uneasy. That night, as the villagers tried to sleep, the whispers became clearer. They spoke in a language no one understood, yet the words dripped with malice and hate. The whispers echoed through the huts, slipping into the minds of the villagers, planting seeds of fear and doubt. Nkem, the chief, tossed and turned in his bed, sweat dripping down his face. In his dreams, he saw a shadow moving through the village, touching each house with dark, bony fingers. Wherever the shadow passed, sickness followed. People fell ill, their faces twisted in pain and terror. The shadow then turned its gaze to Nkem, and he awoke with a start, his heart pounding in his chest. Outside, the whispers continued, growing louder and more menacing. The villagers huddled together, praying for the dawn to come, but the night seemed endless. The darkness outside their huts felt alive, pressing in on them, threatening to consume them. In the deepest part of the forest, where no one dared to venture, the stranger stood, watching the village from afar. His eyes glowed with satisfaction as the first signs of his curse began to take root in Ezi-Ora. The darkness had arrived, and it was only the beginning. The whispers continued for days, driving the villagers to the brink of madness. Children cried constantly, and even the strongest men began to crumble under the weight of their fear. But the worst was yet to come. It started with Amara, a young girl known for her bright smile and laughter. She had been one of the happiest children in the village, always running and playing with her friends. But one morning, her mother found her sitting in a corner, staring blankly at the wall. "Amara, what's wrong?" her mother asked, her voice filled with concern. But Amara did not respond. Her eyes were wide and vacant, her mouth slightly open as if she were trying to speak but couldn't. Her mother shook her gently, but Amara remained unresponsive. Panic set in as more villagers began to show similar symptoms. One by one, people started acting strangely. They would sit in silence for hours, staring into nothingness, or they would speak in low, guttural voices that were not their own. Nkem called for the village healer, an old woman named Mama Ngozi. She had seen many things in her time, but even she was frightened by what was happening. She examined the afflicted villagers, her hands trembling as she performed her rituals. "This is not a sickness of the body," Mama Ngozi said, her voice heavy with fear. "This is a sickness of the spirit. They are possessed." "Possessed?" Nkem echoed, his heart sinking. "Yes," Mama Ngozi said, her eyes dark with worry. "Something dark has entered their souls, something evil that we cannot see. We must act quickly before it spreads further." But before they could do anything, Amara's condition worsened. That night, her mother was awakened by a terrible scream. She rushed to her daughter's side, only to find her writhing on the floor, her eyes rolling back in her head. Amara's body twisted and contorted in unnatural ways, her mouth foaming as she spat out words in a language no one understood. The villagers gathered outside the hut, watching in horror as Amara's body was lifted into the air by an invisible force. Her screams echoed through the night, filled with pain and terror. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Amara fell to the ground, lifeless. The villagers were paralyzed with fear. The darkness was no longer just a whisper, it had become a living nightmare. And as they looked at Amara's lifeless body, they realized that the evil in their village was far more powerful than they had imagined. The death of Amara sent shockwaves through Ezi-Ora. Fear gripped the hearts of the villagers, and a heavy gloom settled over the village. The whispers in the wind grew louder, more insistent, like a chant that no one could escape. The villagers avoided the paths through the forest, and the laughter that once filled the air was replaced by cries of anguish. Nkem, burdened by his role as the village chief, called for an emergency meeting under the baobab tree. Every able-bodied person attended, their faces etched with worry and fear. The elders, who had seen many seasons come and go, had never witnessed such evil in their lifetimes. "We cannot let this darkness consume us," Nkem began, trying to keep his voice steady. We must find a way to protect our people. But how? Asked Adiz, a woman with deep lines of worry on her face. The spirits have turned against us. The land is cursed. We must seek help from the spirit world, said Mama Ngozi, her voice filled with grim determination. There is an ancient ritual, one that has not been performed in many generations. It is dangerous, but it may be our only hope. The villagers listened in silence as Mama Ngozi explained the ritual. It involved summoning the ancestor spirits to drive out the evil that had taken hold of the village. But there was a catch: if the ritual went wrong, it could unleash even greater horrors upon them. We have no choice, Nkem said after a long pause. We must perform the ritual. Gather what you need, Mama Ngozi, and we will do it tonight. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the village, the villagers gathered in the square. They built a large bonfire, its flames dancing wildly in the wind. Mama Ngozi stood at the center, surrounded by the elders, as she began to chant in the ancient tongue. The air grew thick with tension as the ritual progressed. The villagers watched with bated breath, hoping against hope that this would be the answer to their prayers. But as the chanting grew louder, something strange began to happen. The flames of the bonfire flickered and dimmed, as if being smothered by an unseen force. Suddenly, a piercing scream echoed through the night. The villagers turned to see Chika, the young warrior, clutching his head in agony. His eyes turned black as coal, and his body convulsed violently. The elders tried to hold him down, but he threw them off with unnatural strength, his voice a twisted growl that was no longer his own. The ritual has gone wrong, Mama Ngozi shouted, her voice filled with terror. The darkness is fighting back. Chika's body contorted in ways that no human body should, his bones cracking and reshaping under the influence of the dark force. His skin began to blister and burn as if he were being consumed from the inside out. The villagers watched in horror, helpless to stop the transformation. With a final, blood-curdling scream, Chika's body burst into flames, and he collapsed to the ground, a charred husk of his former self. The fire in the square roared back to life, its flames now an ominous green. The villagers could only stare in disbelief as the darkness they had tried to banish seemed to grow stronger, feeding off their fear. The ritual had not driven out the evil, it had only awakened something far more terrifying. And as the night deepened, the villagers knew that they were now facing an enemy far beyond their understanding. In the days that followed, the village fell into chaos. The whispers in the wind grew louder, turning into mocking laughter that echoed through the empty streets. The crops began to wither, and the river, once a source of life, turned dark and foul. The villagers' faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow with fear and despair. Nkem knew they were running out of time. The village was dying, and with it, the hope of survival. In his desperation, he sought out an old legend, one that spoke of a witch who lived deep in the forbidden forest, a witch with the power to bend spirits to her will. No one had dared to approach her for years. She was feared for her dark magic, and it was said that she could summon storms and command the dead. But Nkem had no choice. He gathered his courage and set off into the forest alone, determined to find her. The journey was long and treacherous. The forest was thick with twisted trees and brambles that seemed to grab at Nkem's clothes as he passed. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and strange noises echoed in the darkness, whispers that reminded him of the curse plaguing his village. After hours of walking, Nkem finally arrived at a clearing. In the center stood a small, dilapidated hut, barely visible in the dim light filtering through the trees. A figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, slender woman with long, wild hair and eyes that glowed with an unnatural light. She was the witch, and her presence was as terrifying as the stories had told. "What brings you here, Chief Nkem?" the witch asked, her voice smooth like silk but with an edge that sent shivers down his spine. Nkem swallowed his fear and stepped forward. "My village is cursed," he said. "We need your help to banish the evil that has taken hold of us." The witch smiled, a slow, sinister grin that revealed sharp teeth. "I know of the darkness that plagues your village," she said. "But my help comes at a price." Nkem hesitated. He had expected this, but the reality of dealing with such dark forces was unsettling. "What is your price?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. The witch's eyes narrowed. "A life for a life," she said. "I will rid your village of its curse, but in return, you must bring me the soul of the one you love most." Nkem's heart sank. The one he loved most was his daughter, Ada. She was his pride and joy, the light in his life. Could he really sacrifice her to save the village? The thought tore at his soul, but the faces of his suffering people flashed before his eyes. He had to choose between his daughter and the entire village. I need time to decide," Nkem stammered. The witch's smile faded, replaced by a look of impatience. "You have until the next full moon," she said. "If you do not return by then, the darkness will consume everything. Make your choice wisely, Chief Nkem." With that, the witch turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Nkem alone in the clearing. He felt the weight of the world on his shoulders as he made his way back to the village, his heart heavy with the impossible decision that lay ahead. As he walked through the dark forest, the whispers followed him, more insistent now, as if they knew the terrible choice he would have to make. And deep down, Nkem knew that whatever decision he made, it would haunt him for the rest of his life. Nkem returned to Ezi-Ora with a heavy heart, his mind swelling with the witch's terrible bargain. The village was quieter than before, as if the darkness had drained the life from it. The whispers had become a constant presence, seeping into every corner of the village, filling the air with their sinister murmurings. He couldn't bring himself to tell anyone about the witch's demand, not even his closest advisors. How could he admit that to save the village, he might have to sacrifice his own daughter? The thought alone made his stomach churn with guilt and fear. Days passed, and the full moon drew closer. Nkem grew more withdrawn, his once strong and confident demeanor replaced by a haunted look. He spent hours alone in his hut, staring at the walls, tormented by the decision he had to make. Ada, noticing her father's distress, tried to comfort him. She was a kind-hearted girl, full of life and innocence, and her presence brought some warmth to the coldness that had settled in Nkem's heart. But every time he looked at her, he was reminded of the terrible choice he faced. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the village, Nkem made his decision. He couldn't bear to see his people suffer any longer. He would meet the witch's demands, even if it meant sacrificing his daughter. He called Ada to his heart, trying to keep his voice steady. "Ada, my child, we must take a journey tonight. It is for the good of the village." Ada looked at her father with trusting eyes, unaware of the darkness that lay ahead. "Of course, father. I will go wherever you need me." Nkem's heart ached with every step they took into the forest. The night was eerily quiet, the only sound the crunching of leaves underfoot. The whispers seemed to grow louder as they approached the clearing where the witch's hut stood, as if mocking Nkem's resolve. When they reached the clearing, the witch was waiting for them. Her eyes gleamed in the moonlight, and she smiled when she saw Ada. "You have made your choice, Chief Nkem," she said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. Nkem's throat tightened as he nodded. "Yes," he whispered, barely able to speak. The witch stepped forward, placing a hand on Ada's shoulder. "Do not fear, child," she said, though her tone was far from comforting. "This is your destiny." Before Ada could react, the witch's hand tightened on her shoulder. Ada's face twisted in pain, and a dark, shadowy mist began to swirl around her. Nkem watched in horror, rooted to the spot as the mist enveloped his daughter, her body convulsing in the witch's grip. But then, something unexpected happened. Ada's eyes snapped open, glowing with a fierce, otherworldly light. She raised her hand and grabbed the witch's wrist, her grip so strong that the witch gasped in surprise. No. Ada shouted, her voice layered with a deep, echoing tone that was not her own. I will not be a pawn in your dark games. The witch recoiled, her confident smirk replaced by a look of fear. She tried to pull away, but Ada held fast, the glowing light in her eyes intensifying. What are you?" the witch stammered, her voice trembling for the first time. "I am not yours to command," Ada replied, her voice resonating with a power that sent chills down Nkem's spine. "You seek to use me, but you have underestimated the spirit that dwells within." With a sudden surge of strength, Ada pushed the witch back, and the shadowy mist dissipated. The witch staggered, her eyes wide with terror as she realized she had lost control of the situation. Nkem, still in shock, watched as Ada turned to him, her eyes returning to normal, but her expression hard and determined. "Father," she said, her voice softening, "we must leave this place. There is more to this darkness than we know." Nkem, too stunned to speak, simply nodded. As they turned to leave, the witch cried out, her voice filled with desperation. "You cannot escape the curse. The darkness will consume you all." But Ada did not look back. She led her father away from the clearing, her steps sure and unwavering. As they walked, Nkem could feel the tension in the air, the whispers following them like a malevolent presence. When they finally reached the edge of the forest, Ada stopped and looked at her father. "There is something I need to tell you," she said, her voice heavy with emotion. "I have been having visions, dark visions of our village and the evil that plagues it. The spirit within me, it is strong, and it has been guiding me." Nkem felt a wave of guilt wash over him. He had been willing to sacrifice his own daughter, yet here she was, stronger and braver than he could have imagined. "I am so sorry, Ada," he whispered, tears welling up in his eyes. "I did not know. I did not understand." Ada placed a hand on his arm, offering him a small, sad smile. "You did what you thought was right, father. But now we must work together to save our village. The witch was only a part of the darkness. There is something far more sinister at work." As they returned to the village, Nkem knew that the true battle was just beginning. The darkness was spreading, and the evil that lurked in the shadows was more powerful than they had imagined. But with Ada by his side, Nkem felt a renewed sense of hope, even as the storm clouds gathered overhead. The next day, as the sun struggled to break through the thick clouds that had gathered over Ezi-Ora, Ada and Nkem returned to the village square. The villagers had been waiting anxiously for their return, their faces pale and drawn with fear. "What happened?" Mama Ngozi asked, her voice filled with concern. "Did the witch help us?" Nkem shook his head, his expression grim. "The witch was not what we thought. She sought to use Ada for her own dark purposes, but Ada resisted. There is more to this curse than we understand." The villagers murmured in confusion and fear, but Ada stepped forward, her voice calm and clear. "There is an ancient evil in this village, one that has been hidden for generations. The witch was only a servant of this darkness, not its master. We must find the source of the curse if we are to save ourselves." Mama Ngozi's eyes widened with realization. The source, could it be the old shrine? The one deep in the forest that was abandoned long ago? Nkem's heart sank. He had heard stories of the shrine, a place where dark rituals were once performed. It was said that the spirits had grown angry with the villagers and had cursed the land. The shrine had been sealed off, and no one had dared to enter it for years. "It must be," Ada said, her voice filled with certainty. "The shrine is the key to understanding this curse. We must go there and confront whatever lies within." The villagers looked at each other with fear and uncertainty. The idea of venturing into the heart of the forest, to the place where the curse had originated, was terrifying. But they knew they had no choice. The darkness was spreading, and if they did nothing, the village would be consumed. Nkem nodded, steeling himself for the journey ahead. We will gather a group of warriors and head to the shrine tonight. We must be prepared for whatever we may find. As night fell, the chosen group gathered at the edge of the forest, their faces grim and determined. Ada stood at the front, her eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, a reminder of the power within her. The journey to the shrine was long and treacherous. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees whispering ominously as they passed. Strange shadows flickered at the edges of their vision, and the air grew colder with each step. Finally, they reached the shrine, a crumbling structure covered in vines and moss. The entrance was sealed with an old, rusted gate, but as they approached, the gate creaked open on its own, as if inviting them in. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of decay. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and at the center of the shrine stood an ancient altar, stained with dark, dried blood. The air hummed with a sinister energy, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. As they approached the altar, a cold wind swept through the shrine, extinguishing their torches. In the darkness, they heard a low, rumbling laugh, deep and filled with malice. "You have come at last," a voice said, echoing through the chamber. "But it is too late. The curse has already taken root, and soon, your village will fall." Ada stepped forward, her eyes glowing brightly. "We will not let that happen. Show yourself, spirit, and face us." The air around them grew heavy, and the shadows coalesced into a dark figure, its eyes burning with hatred. "You are brave, a little one," the spirit hissed, "but you are no match for the power that lies here. This land is cursed, and you will all pay the price." As the spirit's laughter filled the shrine, the ground began to tremble, and the walls seemed to close in around them. Nkem realized that they were trapped, and the true battle for Ezi-Ora had only just begun. The ground continued to shake beneath their feet, and the walls of the shrine seemed to pulsate with dark energy. The villagers who had accompanied Ada and Nkem to the shrine huddled together, their fear palpable in the confined space. Ada, her eyes still glowing with the mysterious power within her, stepped forward, defiant in the face of the dark spirit. "We will not let this curse destroy our village," she declared. "We seek the truth. Who cursed this land, and why?" The spirit's laugh echoed through the chamber, a sound that sent shivers down their spines. "You seek the truth," it sneered. "The truth is buried in blood and betrayal. Your ancestors are the ones who brought this curse upon you. They made a deal with forces they could not control, and now, you pay the price." Nkem's heart raced as the spirit's words sank in. Could it be true? Had their ancestors been responsible for the darkness that now threatened them all? The thought was almost too terrible to bear. Before anyone could speak, a sudden light filled the shrine, blinding in its intensity. The dark spirit recoiled, hissing in pain as the light drove it back. From the center of the light, a figure emerged, an old man with a long white beard, dressed in the traditional robes of the village elders. His eyes were wise and kind, but there was a deep sadness in them. "Leave this place, spirit," the old man commanded, his voice firm but gentle. "These people seek to right the wrongs of the past. You have no power over them." The dark spirit snarled in defiance, but the light grew brighter, forcing it to retreat into the shadows. "This is not over," it spat before vanishing completely, leaving the shrine in silence. The villagers stared in awe at the old man, unsure of who or what he was. But Nkem recognized him immediately. He was Okonkwo, one of the most revered ancestors of the village, a man known for his wisdom and strength in times of great trial. "Okonkwo, an ancestor of our people," Nkem said, bowing his head in respect. "Why have you come to us?" Okonkwo looked at them with sorrowful eyes. "I have come to warn you, my children," he said. "The darkness that plagues your village is indeed the result of a terrible pact made long ago." Okonkwo's words hung heavy in the air, filling the shrine with a sense of impending doom. Nkem's heart pounded as he waited for the old ancestor to continue, dreading what he might hear. "Our people," Okonkwo began, his voice laced with regret, once faced a great famine. The land was barren, the rivers dried up, then disease ravaged our ancestors. In their desperation, the village elders sought help from the spirits of the forest. They made a pact with a dark entity, promising a sacrifice in exchange for the prosperity of the land. Nkem felt a cold chill run down his spine. What was the sacrifice, he asked, though he already feared the answer. Okonkwo's eyes darkened. The elders promised the life of the firstborn child of every generation. The spirits would take their soul in exchange for the village's continued prosperity. For years, the pact was kept, and the village flourished. But eventually, the elders tried to break the pact, believing they could outwit the dark forces. A murmur of horror spread through the group. Nkem felt sick to his stomach. The thought of innocent children being sacrificed to feed the village's greed was too much to bear. But the spirits are not easily deceived, Okonkwo continued. The attempt to break the pact only angered the dark entity. It cursed the village, and now that curse has awakened. The darkness you face is the spirit seeking its due, the souls it was promised but never received. Ada stepped forward, her face pale but resolute. We must end this curse, great ancestor. How can we make things right? Okonkwo sighed deeply. The only way to end the curse is to honor the original pact, to offer the spirits what they were promised. But there is another way, a more dangerous path. You must find the entity itself and confront it, force it to release its hold on the village. But be warned, it is a journey that could cost you everything. The shrine fell silent as the villagers absorbed Okonkwo's words. The choice before them was unbearable: sacrifice more innocent lives to appease the dark spirits or face the entity and risk total destruction. We cannot continue this cycle of death, Nkem said, his voice firm with resolve. We will confront the entity and end this curse once and for all. Ada nodded in agreement. We have the strength of our ancestors with us. We will face whatever lies ahead. Okonkwo looked at them with a mixture of pride and sorrow. Then you must prepare yourselves. The path ahead is fraught with danger, and the entity will not give up easily. But remember, the light within you is your greatest weapon. Do not let the darkness consume your hearts. With that, Okonkwo's form began to fade, the light around him dimming until it vanished completely, leaving the shrine in darkness once more. But this time, the darkness felt different, less oppressive, as if Okonkwo's presence had given them a glimmer of hope. Nkem turned to the others, his expression determined. We will gather our strongest warriors and set out at dawn. We will find this entity and put an end to this curse, no matter the cost. As they left the shrine, the night air felt heavy with anticipation. The journey ahead would be their greatest challenge yet, and the outcome was uncertain. But one thing was clear: they could no longer run from the darkness. They had to face it head-on, or risk losing everything they held dear. The dawn arrived, casting a pale light over Ezi-Ora, but there was no sense of renewal. Instead, the village was filled with an eerie quiet, as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for what was to come. Nkem and Ada gathered the warriors they trusted most, along with Mama Ngozi, who had agreed to join them on this perilous journey. The villagers watched silently as the group prepared to leave. There was a shared understanding among them: this journey was their last hope. If Nkem and the others failed, the village would be doomed to the darkness that had already begun to consume it. Before they left, Mama Ngozi insisted on performing a protective ritual. She led them to the sacred grove just outside the village, where she had prepared a small altar adorned with herbs, animal bones, and bowls of sacred oils. The air was thick with the smell of burning incense, and the ground was marked with symbols that only Mama Ngozi understood. This ritual will bind us together and strengthen our spirits, she explained as she motioned for each of them to stand in a circle around the altar. But be warned, once the ritual begins, there is no turning back. It will bind our fates to the outcome of this journey. The group exchanged tense glances, but each one nodded in agreement. There was no room for doubt now, they were committed to seeing this through. Mama Ngozi began to chant in the ancient language, her voice rising and falling with a rhythm that seemed to stir the very air around them. She took a ceremonial knife and made a small cut on her palm, letting the blood drip onto the altar. One by one, each member of the group followed suit, their blood mingling together on the altar. As the blood pooled, the symbols on the ground began to glow with an eerie light. The air crackled with energy, and the group felt a strange warmth spreading through their bodies, as if the very essence of the earth was seeping into their veins. Suddenly, the light flared brightly, and a powerful force surged through the group, causing them to stagger. Images flashed before their eyes, visions of the dark entity, a towering figure of shadow and flame, its eyes burning with a malevolent hunger. They saw the ancient pact being made, the elders of old bowing before the entity, offering their blood in exchange for power. But then the vision shifted, showing them a path through the forest, leading deep into the heart of the darkness. The path was treacherous, filled with traps and horrors beyond imagination. But at the end of it, they saw a flicker of light, a promise of salvation, if they could only reach it. The vision faded as quickly as it had come, leaving the group breathless and shaken. The glow of the symbols dimmed, and the altar was now quiet, the ritual complete. "We are bound by blood," Mama Ngozi said, her voice filled with a solemn intensity. "What one of us feels, we all feel. If one of us falls, we all fall. We must stay united, or the darkness will tear us apart." Nkem felt the weight of her words deeply. The bond they had just formed was powerful, but it also meant that they were more vulnerable than ever. If they failed, the darkness would not just consume the village, but their very souls as well. With the ritual complete, the group set out on their journey. The path was as treacherous as the vision had shown them, filled with twisted trees that seemed to reach out for them, and shadows that moved just beyond the edge of their vision. The air was thick with the smell of rot and decay, and every step felt like a struggle against an unseen force that sought to drag them down. But they pressed on, driven by the knowledge that the fate of their village rested on their shoulders. The journey was long and exhausting, and as the sun began to set, they found themselves standing before a massive stone doorway, half buried in the earth, covered in vines and ancient carvings. "This is it," Nkem said, his voice barely a whisper. "The entrance to the entity's lair." The doorway loomed before them, its surface covered in symbols similar to those they had seen in the shrine. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, and the ground beneath their feet trembled with the power that lay within. Taking a deep breath, Nkem reached out and placed his hand on the stone. It was cold to the touch, and as he pushed against it, the door slowly began to creak open, revealing a dark, yawning chasm beyond. With no other choice, the group stepped inside, the darkness swallowing them whole as the door slammed shut behind them, sealing them in with whatever horrors awaited. The silence was broken only by the distant sounds of whispers and soft, mournful cries, as if the very walls were alive with the echoes of lost souls. Every now and then, they would catch a glimpse of a shadow flickering just out of sight, a reminder that they were not alone in this cursed place. As they ventured deeper into the labyrinth, the path grew narrower, the walls closing in around them. The ghostly lights danced and flickered, casting long shadows that twisted and writhed like living things. The air grew colder, and with each step, the group felt the oppressive weight of the darkness bearing down on them. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet shifted, and the path split into 3 separate tunnels, each one identical to the other. The ghostly lights flared, then dimmed, leaving the group in near total darkness. "We are being tested," Mama Ngozi whispered, her voice trembling. "The labyrinth is trying to divide us." Nkem felt a wave of dread wash over him. He knew that if they chose the wrong path, they might be lost forever in this twisted place. "We must stay together," he said, his voice firm. "We cannot let the labyrinth separate us." Ada nodded in agreement. "We must trust our bond. Let's hold hands and move as one." The group linked hands, forming a chain of solidarity. Together, they stepped into the middle tunnel, their hearts pounding with fear and determination. The walls seemed to close in on them as they moved forward, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They could feel the presence of the trapped souls all around them, their anguish and despair seeping into their minds. As they continued, the tunnel opened into a vast chamber, the walls lined with countless stone faces, each one twisted in a grimace of pain and fear. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the ground was littered with bones, the remnants of those who had been lost to the labyrinth. At the center of the chamber stood a massive stone pedestal, atop which lay a large, ancient tome. The book was bound in dark leather, its cover etched with symbols that seemed to pulse with a sinister energy. The air around it crackled with power, and the group could feel the malevolent presence of the entity growing stronger. "This must be the heart of the labyrinth," Nkem said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The book holds the secrets of the curse." Mama Ngozi stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the tome. "This is a grimoire, a book of dark magic. It contains the rituals used to create the pact, and it holds the key to breaking the curse." As she reached out to touch the book, the stone faces on the walls began to move, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The whispers grew louder, rising to a deafening chorus of voices, each one filled with anger and pain. "You cannot break the pact," the voices cried in unison. "You cannot defy the will of the entity." The ground shook violently, and the walls seemed to close in around them. The group clung to each other, their fear palpable as the chamber was filled with the sound of wailing spirits. "We must do this quickly," Eda said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "Mama Ngozi, what must we do?" Mama Ngozi took a deep breath, steeling herself against the dark energy that surrounded them. "We must read the ritual aloud, but we must also be prepared to face the entity itself. It will not allow us to break the curse without a fight." As she opened the grimoire, the symbols on the pages began to glow with an eerie light. The voices of the spirits grew louder, their cries of despair filling the chamber. With trembling hands, Mama Ngozi began to read the ritual, her voice strong and clear despite the fear that gripped her heart. The words of the ritual echoed through the chamber, a counterpoint to the wails of the spirits. As the final words of the ritual left her lips, the ground shook violently, and a blinding light filled the chamber. The stone faces on the walls screamed in unison, their voices rising to a fever pitch before being abruptly silenced. For a moment, there was nothing but silence and darkness. Then, slowly, the light began to fade, revealing the figure of the entity standing before them. It was a towering figure of shadow and flame, its eyes burning with a malevolent hunger. The air around it crackled with dark energy, and the ground beneath its feet smoldered with an unnatural heat. "You dare to defy me," the entity roared, its voice shaking the very walls of the chamber. "You think you can break the pact that was made in blood?" Nkem stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "We will no longer allow our people to suffer for the mistakes of the past," he said, his voice strong and resolute. "The curse ends here." The entity laughed, a sound that was devoid of any warmth or humor. "You are fools. You cannot break the pact without paying the price." As the entity raised its hand, the ground beneath the group began to crack and crumble, the dark energy of the labyrinth swirling around them like a storm. The air was filled with the sound of wailing spirits, their cries echoing in the darkness. But Nkem, Eda, and the others stood their ground, their hands still linked in a circle of unity. They could feel the bond of the ritual pulsing through their veins, a connection that strengthened them against the entity's dark power. With a roar of fury, the entity unleashed a wave of dark energy, but the group held fast, their unity shielding them from the worst of the attack. Mama Ngozi continued to chant the words of the ritual, her voice growing louder and more confident with each passing moment. The entity howled in rage as the ritual's power began to take hold. The dark energy that surrounded it began to weaken, the flames flickering and the shadows retreating. The air was filled with the sound of cracking stone and the wailing of the trapped souls as the labyrinth itself began to crumble. With a final, deafening roar, the entity was consumed by a blinding light, its form disintegrating into nothingness. The ground beneath them shook one last time before finally falling silent. The chamber was bathed in an eerie silence, the dark energy that had filled the air now gone. The stone faces on the walls were still, their eyes dark and lifeless. The labyrinth was collapsing, but the group remained unharmed, their bond stronger than ever. Nkem, breathing heavily, looked around at the others. "We did it," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "The curse is broken." Mama Ngozi nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "Yes, but we must leave this place quickly. The labyrinth is falling apart." The group turned and made their way back through the labyrinth, the walls crumbling around them as they hurried to escape. The path that had once been treacherous now seemed easier, as if the very land was guiding them out. As they emerged from the stone doorway and back into the light of day, they were met with the sight of the village, bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun. The air was fresh and clean, the oppressive darkness that had once hung over the village now gone. The villagers, who had been anxiously waiting for their return, erupted in cheers of joy and relief as they saw Nkem, Ada, and the others emerge from the forest. The curse that had plagued their village for generations was finally broken. But as the group stood before the villagers, they knew that their journey was not yet over. The entity may have been defeated, but the scars of the past still lingered. The village would need time to heal, and there were still questions that needed answers. As Nkem and Ada looked out at their people, they knew that they had faced the darkness and won. But the true challenge lay ahead, in rebuilding their village and ensuring that such a curse would never again take hold of their land. Will Nkem and Ada conquer the true challenge of rebuilding their village and ensuring that a curse would never again take hold of their land? Join us on our next episode to find out.